मथानत प्रणति अर्पण करुछु। ओडिशा को स्वतंत्र प्रदेश मान्यता देवा पाई योजनाबद्ध उद्यम आरंभ करिथिबा अनन्य संग्रामी ओडिशा और ओडियांक टेक रखा निजर तमाम जीवन को उत्सर्ग करिथिबा ए समर्पित प्राण कुलवृद्ध मधुबाबू आज से पगड़ी पुरुष को तंकर पवित्र पुण्यतिथि अवसर में स्मरण करी आज द्वितीय दिवस आद्य अधिवेशन कार्यक्रम को आम आपण मान को स्वागत करुछु। एक वर्णाढ्य परिवेश भितर आज आम समस्ते एठारे समवेत एवं से चेतना को अंगीकार करे से दिन मधुबाबू पगड़ी पुरुष जहाँ गाई जाति प्रेम बन्ही प्रज्वलित कर स्वार्थ को दिय आहुति स्वार्थ मेध यज्ञ चारिआडे नाच छाती को मिसाई छाती। आज प्रतिटी ओडिया आत्मप्रसाद अनुभव करुछंती जेतेबेले भाषा एवं साहित्य को नहीं एभली एक सम्मेलन आयोजन करा जायछि। आम भाषा आम अतीतर अस्तित्व आम भाषा आम भविष्यत से भाषार ऐश्वर्य एवं आम साहित्यर माधुर्य को लोकाभिमुखी करने विश्वमुखी करने राज्य सरकार ये अभिनंदनीय प्रयास रे आपण माने संयुक्त पुणी थे आम आपण मान को स्वागत करुछु। बंधुगण आज ये आद्य अधिवेशन वरेण्य आलोचक भाव आज आम जहाँ को पाइछु से होउछंती प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा। डेनमार्क प्रसिद्ध आरहुस विश्वविद्यालय रे भारत एवं दक्षिण एशिया अध्ययन विभाग रे सहयोगी प्राचार्य भावे कार्यरत थिबा डॉक्टर यूवी स्कोडा अध्ययन एवं अनुशीलन एक प्रमुख अंश हेउछि ओडिशा और पूर्व भारत अंतर्गत सांस्कृतिक प्रसंग। आज आमे विशेष भाव में एभली एक कार्यक्रम स्वागत करुचु जहाँकर निर्दिष्ट समय निर्धारित समय आलोचना रहिबो। आलोचनार शीर्षक ओडिशार मननशील अध्ययन लिप्सु संप्रदाय ओडिशा गवेषणा प्रकल्प अतीत और भविष्यत। ए स्कॉलरली कम्युनिटी अराउंड ओडिशा द ओडिशा रिसर्च प्रोजेक्ट्स लुकिंग बैक and looking ahead. Indeed, we are very much delighted to introduce Professor Skoda. Professor Skoda is a renowned professor of India and South Asia Studies at Aarhus University, Denmark. He currently focuses on issues around visual culture in India, especially in Odisha and Eastern India and Indian Ocean regions as well. His recent publications include Bonding with Lord Jagannath, Popular Culture and Community Formation, which have received wider acclaim, wider appreciation. आज एभली एक आद्य समावेश एवं प्रथम विश्व ओडिया भाषा सम्मेलन द्वितीय दिवस यही विशेष मुहूर्त आम आपण मानकर उच्छ्वसित करताली प्रोफेसर स्कोडा को स्वागत करूँ। May I now request Professor Skoda to kindly give his deliberation to address the congregation on a scholarly community around Odisha, the Odisha research projects looking back and looking ahead. With a big round of applause, we request Professor Skoda to kindly address the congregation.
Thank you. Can I use this one? Do it if I go to the next slide.
Okay.
Just do it right now. This is forward, is it better? Okay. Namaskar or Johar. Moi 25 pos agoru protam tore Orissa ku aitili au tapore again and again, ete tore peri asici, academic kamopai, mui Bhubaneswar au Puri, au Paschim Orissa Dekichi, au Orissa ku asilabile sabubele hushi laguche, Orissa ete sunda jaga, au Oria ete sunda basha, au etiro lokomane ekdom boria. Nimantran pai, bahut danyavad, Oriata autike bolore kuhiba pai chesta kuruchi, kintu presentation oriare agresire koribi. I hope that's okay. Today's topic has already been introduced, and I will focus with this little quote from Redfield on one little community of scholars that evolved with scholars from Orissa, scholars from Germany, around two major projects over the last decades. And I would like to start with two brief personal autobiographic vignettes. As an anthropologist or an anthropology student at Freie Universität Berlin, the Free University of Berlin, I remember entering the office of Professor Georg Pfeffer in the 90s, noticing the trinity of Lord Jagannath, Lord Balabhadra and Subhadra adorning the walls of a large Talapatra Chitra depicting the Lord, his Rath Yatra, and so on. And you can see similar pieces here. But my understanding of the history behind these artifacts and their status as metonymic symbols of Orissa was limited, and I was not familiar with the specific history of an Orissa research project which had focused precisely on these deities in the 1970s, and whose second avatar I would join in 2000. Many years later, in 2019, while visiting the splendid Museum Riedberg in Zurich in Switzerland, I met Johannes Belz, Deputy Director and Curator of India and South Asia Collection at the museum, whom I incidentally knew through the Orissa Research Project. After flipping through some Orissa-related publications displayed at the museum shop, he introduced me to staff as somebody who also did research on Orissa. "Are you also a Purixi?" asked the lady at the museum shop counter, knowing about Orissa and Puri, the connection Johannes Belz and I had, and we were apparently included in this category of scholars working on Orissa. And the point I'm trying to make here is that through these projects, through the scholars, even in a museum in Switzerland, in Zurich, people would come to know about Orissa. They would see the publications, they would see the exhibitions, and would be able to learn about Orissa through these projects. Starting from some such interactions and symbols around the project, I would like to explore the community formation among scholars working on Orissa and Lord Jagannath, that is, with reference to two major academic projects from 1970 to 75 and 1999 to 2005, funded by the German Research Council, the so-called Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, an agency that carries the name Community Gemeinschaft in its name. Both projects involved a broad range of institutions and scholars of different academic levels, and there were seniors like Professor Kuhlke and others, and juniors like Johannes Belz and me. Some were associated for longer periods, some were associated for shorter periods. But what I'm trying to say is basically that the size, the scale of the projects, but also the longer period that the project was running over 5-6 years, helped to create a kind of community around these projects that had repercussions long after the end of the projects. Taking this diversity of scholars into account and being based on interviews that I did with some of them, I would like to sort of trace the history and dynamics of these closely related projects that indicate a sustained engagement with colleagues and friends in Orissa and India, and shows a peculiar and remarkable evolution of a scholarly community over decades. It focuses specifically on the joint yet constantly negotiated framework and goals on scholarly genealogies, as well as the shared and often privileged, at times vulnerable positions of the scholars in the field, contributing to a certain sense of community. The scholarly practices of publishing and creating resources further prolonged and added to a certain consciousness, while the project simultaneously had its spillover effects from the academic sphere into the homes of scholars involved, from the field, so to say, into the private sphere. Including this popular culture dimension hints at an effective dimension and a profound bonding with Orissa and Lord Jagannath, as well as other deities, Ma Samle and others, beyond the professional realm. Now, what do I mean with this scholarly community? Without rehearsing any theories around community here or the concept, it's merely argued that this community was stretching, so to say, over two projects, including scholars from India and Germany, all engaged in this project with a shared characteristics, so to say, of classical notions of communities regarding the intellectual bonding, the spirit, so to say, of the project, or anthropological notions of small-scale communities, more or less harmonious face-to-face interactions. But more importantly here, this kind of community can be understood as a community of practice. A community of practice typically involves core members and others in peripheral roles, newcomers and experts, and was defined by Wenger and Agrifolio, and I'm borrowing the term from them, as a group of people who come together to share common interests and goals with the aim of sharing information, developing knowledge, and developing themselves, both personally and professionally. And there are three dimensions that these scholars have highlighted. First, the mutual engagement. We interact constantly with each other as we are doing it here today through this wonderful conference. The joint enterprise, so to say, what is the purpose, the goal of the project, and thirdly, a shared repertoire, which is produced in the process, the outcome, so to say, publications and other things. The productivity of such a community of practice is often fostered by diversity rather than homogeneity. So it's explicitly including scholars from different places, scholars of different statuses, even though some have more power than others in the process. There are supervisors and others, so it's a certain diversity in many ways. But Wenger and the scholars do not project an idyllic image of a community. It's not always harmonious. There are a lot of disagreements in such communities about approaches, about how to go about it in the project, and that's part of a scholarly debate. And of course, there were many of these scholarly debates within the community, and also the repertoire that was produced, the books from the first project, were later on, of course, contested, and of course, that led also to a second project later on. So, let me briefly summarize these two projects and then maybe stretching out what we could do to go ahead from here to new projects, perhaps. These two projects that you can see here started or emerged out of a broader interest in temple cities, and Professor Kulke's PhD dissertation on Chittambaram in '67 expressed this focus. In contrast to Tamil Nadu, where others worked, the extent of the research on Orissa's temple cities in the '60s was relatively more limited, evolving at that time in many ways, leaving scope for a larger project. A pilot was conducted in '69 by Professor Kulke and Professor G.C. Tripathi, who later on became the field director of ORP1 in Orissa. The pilot project was timely because it was followed in July by the grand Nabekhalevada ritual of renewal, and the positive results augured well for the project, which was finally granted in 70, and it became the highest category of German research projects, which is the Sonderforschungsbereich, or special research area number 16, and showed the remarkable importance of this project for the German Research Council to grant such a big project. So scale again matters here a lot, because it would draw in people from different parts of Orissa, from India, from Germany and other places in Europe later on. Initially, there were 3 German universities, 3 Indian universities. You can see this on the slide, including Utkal University in Bhubaneswar. And it was a broad range of disciplines, from Indology to economics, from anthropology to art history, and so on, all of them included. These scholars then would stay in Orissa together, often in the same compound. Later on, a first group arriving in 70, 71, would stay in Bhubaneswar most of the time, but simultaneously, I think that's equally important, scholars from Orissa, like Gorgon Dash and others, would travel to Germany and spend time in Germany, in Heidelberg, and Professor Nivedita Mohanty would do that later on as well, stay in Heidelberg and do the work there. The academic environment emerging in Orissa turned out to be very conducive for the project. Looking back in 2001, Kulke and Burkhard Schnepel and others listed various contributions of scholars from Orissa around that time that would help in the project very substantially. Among those contributions was Hare Krishna Matab's work, The History of Orissa, with a chapter titled The Cult of Jagannath, the work of K.C. Mishra, who did his PhD thesis, published later on in 71, also with the title The Cult of Jagannatha, as the first scholarly monograph on Lord Jagannath. But there were other publications on the Madalapanji, etc., by A.B. Mohanty, that all raised the awareness not only of this pivotal text, but also added to the scholarly debates around Lord Jagannath, his origin, the temple, and so on. So there was a very fertile ground that led the project to a success. And this fertile ground was existing in Orissa through scholars from Orissa who engaged subsequently very intensively with the German scholars arriving in the early 70s. Moreover, the foundation stone laying of the Lord Jagannath Temple in Delhi in 69 was accompanied by a souvenir volume that included research papers from authors such as S.N. Rajguru, K.N. Mahapatra, and Prabhat Mukherjee, also contributing to a certain growing Jagannath consciousness. And unlike the previous dominance of scholars from Bengal or other parts working on the history of pre-colonial Orissa, it was the Orissan scholars who took over in this period as the first generation focusing on Orissa's cultural history. And as Kulke explained later on, they were considered, these scholars, S.N. Rajguru and others, by the German scholars arriving as gurus. The gurus paving the way for the success of this project, and the fruitful cooperation was based on reciprocity. And there were certainly other scholars also around from the Harvard project and others, but I will not go into the details here. Theoretically, the first project and its final volume, The Cult of Jagannath and the Original Tradition of Orissa, stated, as you can see here in the title and the cover page, focusing on the regional tradition, the importance of a regional Orissan tradition, which had been neglected earlier on, but was actually not only literally the central portion of India's traditions, but also, as the author stated, the true melting pot of the local and the all-Indian tradition. The regional was located by the research project between the Sanskrit tradition, often considered as unspoiled, and a village life equally often idealized as pure. While both Indology and anthropology may have relegated the regional tradition to a background earlier on, The first project, focused precisely on one such tradition, namely the importance of the Orissan regional tradition. And that had left its mark on language, architecture, dance, and so on. The theoretical framing responded critically to Radcliffe's dominant concept of the great and little tradition by stressing the crucial middle layer in history and society. It highlighted the role of sacred centers of regional traditions, first and foremost Puri, both as nucleus of such a tradition and as a transmission belt between higher and lower levels. And I'm sure Professor Kulke would elaborate on this in his presentation later on. While this approach was related to the theoretical premises of those years, several members increasingly felt uncomfortable with this approach, reflected critically on its unintended side effects. As Professor Pfeffer later on argued, and I quote, "Over the years, we began to question our initial hypothesis, doubtlessly born out of ignorance, proposing the existence of a neat, centrally administered religious, economic, and political system, which during the course of a millennium had been organized in the delta of the Mahanadi. A certain feeling, not altogether uncommon among ethnographers all over the world, indicated that our center had achieved such a status simply because we had engaged ourselves in a rather conspicuous spot without much information of the world beyond." So what Pfeffer was arguing, and others for the Orissa project too, you cannot understand the center, Puri, the temple, without understanding the relations the center has with the society in Orissa. And that became the focus of the second project afterwards. The continuity nevertheless existed and was certainly expressed by members being represented in both projects, including Goran Dash, including Professor Kulke and many others. And in 1997, another conference happened in Germany, in Heidelberg, with the title Jagannath Revisited, Studying Society, Religion and the State in Orissa, that offered an opportunity to discuss new concepts of theoretical angles, later enriching the successful application of the second project. And you can see the cover page of the volume that came out of this conference in '97. So the second project was a different funding category, but included even more German universities, including Kiel, Berlin, and many others, and also more and more Orissan universities and Indian partners, including Sambalpur University and many others. After almost 25 years and a few minor projects in the meantime, many former members received funding for another big project of major engagement with Orissa, with the region, with younger scholars coming up. Many PhD students were funded through the project, including myself, and started working on various topics in Orissa, leading to new perspectives and a more gender-balanced overall project. When the second project started in '99, society in Orissa obviously had changed already dramatically and had undergone a period of accelerated change unleashed by the liberalization of the economy and other factors. So the project tried to address these changes, tried to understand them, and benefited also from new research conducted on Lord Jagannath, including the work of Ichita Banerjee Dubey, Yamine Mubai. You can see both cover pages here, but also scholars influenced by the subaltern studies, including the late Bishwa Moipati, the late Bhairabi Sahu, or Chandi Prasad Nanda, all associated with the second project. Thematically, the project tried to strike a balance between continuity and change. A focus on Lord Jagannath and the temple remained, but new sources, small archives, private archives, or dynastic chronicles were accessed and older sources reinterpreted in the light of new approaches. So the cult of Lord Jagannath, the first volume, was therefore discussed in the broader context of an Oriya and regional identity, but also other identities, local, national, etc., and how these identities influenced each other, destabilized each other. Research on Mahima Dharma, following on Anne-Charlotte Eschmann's legacy, continued, and more generally, supposedly homogeneous and stable identities were scrutinized and questioned and seen as overlapping, contradictory, etc. This went hand in hand with a shift away from the sacred center to diverse folk and tribal traditions, to Adivasis and various communities in southern Orissa, from region to sub-regional identities. Questions of origins turned into questions of context, of time and place, meanings for and agency of diverse actors. Perspectives from the margins and peripheries, socially as well as geographically, earlier not an explicit focus, were considered crucial to complement hegemonic discourses and in order to understand centers in their complexity and multifaceted nature. An approach that included not only Lord Jagannath, but also other centers and other deities, especially goddesses. Thus, theoretically, a considerable shift away from the elite and dominant discourses was also postulated here in the project. Now, let me move on to a few details of how these projects were actually done. And one of the things that you can see through these projects over various decades is genealogies of scholars evolving. Scholars from the first project become supervisors in the second project. And those scholars now even became supervisors to new PhD students. So you can see this kind of genealogy, or almost like a school, emerging in various ways. And the formerly younger junior scholars became senior scholars, fatherly figures, supervisors, or gurus, if you like. And that's pretty typical for many of these communities of practice. So you can see some, it's not complete, not at all, but some of those genealogies here that the scholars later on were part of. A special case, and let me move on, is the pioneering work of Anne-Charlotte Eschmann, which remained incomplete due to her sudden death in 1977. And you can see her sitting here with the Mahima Dharma Babas in one of these early photographs from the 70s. So this work continued with Bhishma Moipatti, with Lydia Guzi, with Johannes Belz and others, and was also understood as a way of academic mourning the loss of one of those founding scholars. There are many other scholars like Purna Chandra Mishra being involved not only in the Orissa project, but also many other scholarly projects later on. He was involved in various Orissa palm leaf manuscript studies, but also basically involved in almost every other project following ORP1. It is also worth mentioning here that scholars supported each other in many, many different ways. And for example, Jakob Rösel from the first Orissa project learned Oriya from his teacher Gogon Das. So there was another kind of bonding emerging here. Let me briefly turn to another aspect, and that's the idea of a kind of element of exoticism that was surrounding the projects. We were outsiders, Hermann Kulke at one point explained in 2018, referring to the conditions in the 1960s when a group of scholars suddenly arrived in Bhubaneswar, and there were certainly questions around this new group of people arriving. However, as they were arguing later on, this kind of initial status as strangers, as foreigners, soon gave way to forms of integration. And these scholars were subsequently integrated into families of their Orissan counterparts, certainly became what Peter Berger later on called integrated outsiders. So they were part and parcel of the society in many ways and continue to do so. The gaze that affected researchers in both projects is also expressed in an anecdote Jakob Rösel remembered while going through old photographs of the project days. And I would just like to mention it here because it, I think, shows the kind of exotic element that was part of the first project at that time. experimenting with studio photography in Bhubaneswar, he had his photo taken with studio props, the cutouts, of gopis sitting and standing, while he himself wore an attire that could easily be understood as hippie. After the photograph had been taken, the owner of the studio used it as an advertisement for his windows, presumably to highlight the fact that he had some customers from Europe and to attract more customers in this way. He succeeded in the sense that the photo caused considerable attention, with a lot of people stopping and looking at the photographs. A combination of a novelty factor with an exotic status, so to say, as a foreigner, a kind of a hippie sap as it was interpreted in those days in the 60s, and that with a gopi in this exoticized photographic production which differed from the familiar modes of representation. It turned out to be a kind of attraction in Bhubaneswar, as he remembered, but also caused worries within the project because some colleagues were worried that such a photograph would perhaps influence the reputation of the project. There were other factors contributing to a community. I think one of the factors you can see here, and those are old photographs from Jakob Rösel that he shared from the early 70s, the project houses in Bhubaneswar. And you can see how much Bhubaneswar, this was on the outskirts in an area which was called Barga Road at that time, near Kalpana Street, how this area has changed over time. In fact, Rösel remembered it was referred to as Paharganj area, now of course completely surrounded by other buildings and no longer in this shape. So the city has grown, and also the projects changed over many times in this way. People stayed there together, German scholars, Indian scholars, G.C. Tripathi was one of the persons staying there, and many others. And however, it worked. They were living together, they were working together, and so to say, spent considerable time with each other. They had certain privileges. As you can see, the car, the Jeep was there, somewhat unusual in those days, but those were aspects strongly related to the research and were, so to say, a necessity at those times, but raised questions about the status of the community at one point of time. So in contrast to the first Orissa project, the second one didn't have the cluster of people staying together. They stayed in different places, far away sometimes, in southern Orissa or other parts. They had a research hub in southern Orissa, but the co-living, so to say, was very different. Another aspect that I would just highlight is the production of resources, the creation, and of course, Arlo and others have already highlighted the work with manuscripts that was central in those projects. It was particularly central for the first Orissa project, and as Benedict Anderson famously argued, print technologies and print capitalism facilitated an imagining of communities. So here perhaps one could, in a lighter vein, argue that the work with manuscripts also fostered the imagining of a community in many ways. Without postulating any direct correspondence, the collaborative work of the scholarly community on its printed products appears to have contributed to the fostering of a sense of community. So over the years, you have many of these manuscripts published, copied, later on donated to the Orissa State Museum and other organizations. And this is a work that continued in many ways in the second project and beyond. If you allow me a second of shameless self-promotion, I would like to highlight a volume here that I brought out in 2013 with a colleague from Sambalpur University, Rashmi Pramanik, and we published in Oriya and in English translations of the Vamshavalis or the Bonairo Bonsaboli that was, so to say, gathered and then printed in this project. And as you can see, the Kadamba Gata was a part of that project and part of the volume later on. So copies of these manuscripts were preserved, were given to the various institutions in Orissa, but also remained in Heidelberg and were finally also handed over as copies to the National Archives of India, here with the center in Orissa, the Record Center Eastern Zone. Apart from the manuscripts, the publications played a central role. And as you can see, there were not only the one big volume, The Cult of Jagannath from the first project, but there were various other publications emerging out of the project. Some of them have unfortunately not been translated from German into English or Oriya, but you can see the work, for example, of Jakob Rösel, The Palace of the Lord of the Universe in German, but you can also see the habilitation of Professor Kulke, and you can see the Orissa bibliography that was edited by Gogon Das, Kulke, and others. So these publications were central to the projects. Many, many more emerged. I cannot refer to every publication here, but it certainly fostered the intensive collaboration. Similarly, the second project had a rich list of publications that were often linked to the annual conferences of the community, so to say, often in Germany, with scholars from India attending, also scholars from Holland. I think Arlo was in one of the conferences as well. So there were annual conferences focusing on aspects of these, and the first row is particularly a list of conference volumes that included then scholars from Japan like Akio Tanabe, but also Bhairavi Sahu, Shishir Kumar Panda, Bidi Chattopadhyaya, and many other scholars that were included in these ventures. And that continued later on with felicitary volumes for Professor Pfeffer and Professor Kulke and so on. So it's an ongoing process. And last but not least, while there was no grand volume of the second project, a grand set of 2 volumes finally emerged with the title Imaging Orissa, co-edited by Professor Nivedita Mohanty, plus Professor Kulke, plus also Prasanna Kumar Das as editor and publisher. And I think it's a fantastic volume that you can hopefully also see soon. Beyond the publications, there were various exhibitions promoting Orissan culture, promoting the scholarly work that happened in those projects. And this is again just a very, very short summary of exhibitions in Zurich, for example, with Cornelia Malebrein, also bringing out a fantastic catalog, plus others like Johannes Belz, not only focusing on Lord Jagannath and the Puri tradition, but also on bronzes, for example, from the Adivasi areas of Orissa and Middle India. So there were various aspects of Orissan culture, Orissan traditions highlighted here. And you can see the title, for example, The Street Parade of the Gods, is basically a list, a title for an exhibition of Dokra art. Now, the last aspect of these projects or the community I would highlight is how this community, so to say, brought Orissa, brought Lord Jagannath, brought other Orissan deities into the homes of the scholars in Germany. So Lord Jagannath and other deities became part of the family life of these scholars in Germany and popularized it way beyond Orissa. So you can see here an example, for example, an LP which was donated by Gogon Das to Professor Kulke. You can see the Trinity here that is from my own home and which I got gifted by Chandi Prasad Nanda at one point of time, and it's part of my family, so to say. And Professor Kulke, who had the longest, so to say, link to Orissa, even argued at one point of time that Lord Jagannath also became a family deity of his own family in Germany. To add a little bit of Guru Dakshina for Professor Kulke here from my side, I would just like to add that you can see here various gifts that he received. He received the Rat from Prabhat Mukherjee. Also, his daughter actually made the middle image in 1980, which was sent to the Kulke family and is presented in their home at the moment. And you can see the little kind of a house shrine where Professor Kulke is sitting there, which was a few years ago now. So this became part and parcel of the family life of scholars in Germany, going back from Orissa or going back and forth basically. And many scholars, for example, Lydia Gusi, would argue that apart from the books and all the other products that were produced in the projects, these representations of the lords were more important perhaps at the end than some of the publications, and are more appreciated than sometimes the books. So to conclude, I would like to argue that various forms of collaboration contributed to an intense form of academic collaboration between Orissa, between India, between Germany, the universities that were involved, and the individual scholars that were involved, who became integrated into Orissan societies, into Orissan families, were using kinship terms. For example, Prabhat Mukherjee became then Uncle Mukherjee for the children of families from the first Orissa project. So it went way beyond purely academic work, and it had its spillover effects into the family life of those families, particularly the families spending time in Orissa together. We expanded the projects in many ways, but the focus on Orissa, the focus on Lord Jagannath remained in many ways, but was supplemented by additional aspects, the links to the Adivasi communities, the links to Western Orissa and others. And here you can see, moving on to my last point, moving ahead, so to say, you can see, I would argue that again, a very fertile ground has emerged for a new project. And you can see again, I mean, the work of Professor Nivedita Mohanty there, ongoing over many, many years. You can see the work that I did together with a colleague, Jyotimoy Tripathi, who cannot be here today, but it's based at IIT Madras, but is working on Orissa for many, many years. And you can also see the work of Peter Berger, who is now in Holland. You can see the work of Italian scholars working on Orissa in the field of environmental humanities. So there is a lot of work happening. And I could see this yesterday. I mean, how many exciting projects are going on? I mean, it's fantastic. And the question is, could scholars come together again to merge, so to say, or to unite for another new international ORP, for another international Orissa project. There's definitely a new generation, or new generations in plural, of scholars here who have their own ideas and new approaches. There's a whole new educational landscape with many new universities that have opened or have started doing their own work. And there are plenty of themes. And I should perhaps move to the next slide. So there is a conducive timing. There is a question of integrating new generations of scholars, including the focus on many new themes. Digitizing society, mediatizing language, mediatizing religion, mediatizing history is the question of the day, basically. How do we do this? How this is changing society? And I think that could be an important focus for another project. I'm also involved in a project that is looking at links between good life and development. I mean, how the development on such a grand scale that happened in Orissa over the last years is linked to ideas of how we want to live. What kind of good life we imagine with this development, what kind of better life we would like to envision for us or our future generations. And I think those aspects, how this could be achieved with technologies such as digitization, could be a crucial focus point for a new project. So I think this first World Oriya Language Conference would be a fantastic occasion to think perhaps about another first, a first international Orissa research project that goes beyond Germany, goes beyond Orissa, includes the Oriya diaspora in many places, includes other European countries, to have a grand project that would then lead to a better understanding of aspects of society and change. So with these words, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you with Jai Jagannath, Jai Ma Samleshwari. Thank you very much.
प्रारंभरे आम ओडिया भाषा रे आपण मान को संबोधित करी शेषरे जय जगन्नाथ जय माँ समलेश्वरी उच्चारण सहित ए आसर रे निजर ओडिया भाषा प्रीति संपर्क रे बेस गभीर सूचना प्रदान करिसेंती एवं ओडिशार मननशील अध्ययन लिप्सु गोष्ठी को प्रशंसा करी ओडिशा गवेषणा प्रकल्प पई एक उज्ज्वल अतीत थिला एवं एक भविष्यत मध्य तार उज्ज्वल ए संपर्क रे आम समस्त को अवधारणा दैछंती। आमे प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा को अनेक अनेक बधाई जनाऊँ एवं आज द्वितीय दिवसर आद्य अधिवेशन वरेण्य प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा को अनेक कृतज्ञता जनाई आमे मंचरे संबर्धना पाई मंच को आमंत्रण करूँ। मान्यवर मुख्यमंत्री मुख्य उपदेष्टा माननीय श्री आर बालकृष्णन महोदय को आमे मंचरे मध्य स्वागत करुचु। ओडिशार माननीय मुख्य शासन सचिव सम्मान्य श्रीयुक्त प्रदीप जेना महोदय को प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा को ए मंचरे आरुहुस विश्वविद्यालय डेनमार्क लब्ध प्रतिष्ठ प्रोफेसर प्राचार्य को ए मंचरे संबर्धित करने आपण मानकर विपुल करताली सहित स्मृति संतक एवं प्रीति उपहार प्रदान करी प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा को आम अभिनंदन जनाऊँ जे ओडिशार गवेषणा एक विशेष सुजोग रही तार अतीत महान एवं तार एक उज्ज्वल भविष्यत को देखिपारुथिबा एभली जड़े मननशील अध्ययन लिप्सु जड़े प्राचार्य जे कि आरुहुस विश्वविद्यालय डेनमार्क आसी ओडिशार कला संस्कृतिर गरिमा संपर्क में आम समस्त को अवधारणा देइछंती। अनेक अनेक अभिनंदन जनाऊँ एवं मान्यवर मुख्यमंत्री मुख्य उपदेष्टा श्री आर बालकृष्णन महोदय को एवं मुख्य शासन सचिव माननीय श्री प्रदीप जेना महोदय को अनेक अनेक कृतज्ञता जनाऊँ। प्रोफेसर स्कोडा को ए मंचरे संबोधन देइथिबारु संबर्धना देइथिबारु अभिनंदन जनाइथिबारु। अनेक अनेक कृतज्ञता जनाई प्रोफेसर स्कोडा महोदय को आम मंचरू मेलाणी देवु। जदिओ अधिवेशन एक प्रश्न उत्तर पर्याय रही किंतु समय आमको अनुमति देउ नाही। द्वितीय चरण रे आमे परवर्ती अधिवेशन रे आपण मानक पई रखिछु। आज एभली एक विशेष कार्यक्रम रे आधुनिक ओडिशार अभ्युदय एभली एक शीर्षक को नहीं आलोचना रहिबो जहिरे डॉक्टर निवेदिता महांती लब्ध प्रतिष्ठ ऐतिहासिक अध्यक्षतार कार्यक्रम संचालित हेब जहिरे विशिष्ट सारस्वत साधक एवं ऐतिहासिक मानकर उपस्थित रहुछि। प्रसंग को नहीं आलोचना रहिबो। आमे अनेक अनेक कृतज्ञता अर्पण करी मंचरू मेलाणी देवु माननीय प्रोफेसर यूवी स्कोडा महोदय को आपण मानकर उच्छ्वसित करताली सहित। चतुर्थ अधिवेशन प्रसंग रही आधुनिक ओडिशार अभ्युदय जो आम मंच प्रस्तुति सहित मात्र 2 मिनिट्र समय मध्य चतुर्थ अधिवेशन को आरंभ करने आपण मानकर अनुमति लोड़ुचु। ए कार्यक्रम को सामग्रिक भाव में आद्य अधिवेशन को सफल करिथिबारु सफलतार श्रेय आपण मान प्रदान करुचु। वंदे उत्कल जननी।